Welcome to the Financial Freedom Podcast, where we interview remarkable people and share strategies for mastering money and living a meaningful life. With your host, Grant Sabatier, creator of Millennial Money and author of Financial Freedom, a proven path to all the money you will ever need.
This episode is sponsored by Qapital, the savings and investing app that I'll tell you more about in the middle of this episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Financial Freedom Podcast. I'm very excited today to have both a guy that I've admired for a very long time, the first personal finance blog that I ever read, and now a dear friend, the incomparable JD Roth, founder of GetRichSlowly.org, and all around amazing dude. JD, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Grant. It's very good to be here.
So JD and I have had this sort of closet obsession. If you follow me on Instagram, you might know a little bit about it, but we both collect old personal finance and money books and have a shared passion for the history of personal finance. And so I wanted to change things up on the show and bring JD on to have a real live conversation about some of the books that each of us have found that are super cool and try to put together some coherent narrative around when did Americans start thinking about money and managing money, and how has that changed? And maybe surprisingly, how has that not changed very much over the past 150 years or so. So we don't have a script for this. This is an open conversation. We have no idea where it's going to go or what's going to happen, but that's the topic: history of personal finance, old money books. Let's do it, man.
It may be that it's only you and I that are interested in this because we're such money nerds. But I don't know.
But I think the takeaways are universal.
Yeah. It's fun. For me, I'm old now. I'm 51. And so for me, the older I get, the more interested I am in history. When I was in high school, I thought history was so boring, all these facts and figures and dates and battles. And then in college, it was a little bit interesting when I realized, I could learn about the history of the Pacific Northwest because, I live in Oregon. And I'm like, let's learn about the history. That's mildly interesting. But the older I get, the more this history stuff, it just fascinates me because let's use our modern political climate as an example. It's so contentious. But if you look at the history of the United States, it's baked in. This contentiousness has been here since the start. And I think we all are aware of that now because Hamilton has become such a phenomenon, and it's all about the contentiousness that's baked in. So I guess for me, history, you don't always learn something from history, but you can't, it kind of like illuminates the present, it makes it richer and it helps you understand what's going on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think when the same thing with personal finance, I mean, you think about why was the United States started? People were unhappy with their lot in life. We're a nation of immigrants, people who were unhappy with the way in which, they weren't able to make money or live a life that they want. And so they came to this country to start a new life. I mean, that's founded, within our history, and money is an essential component of that. Americans have since the beginning been in search of money and sustenance, and, we're the most entrepreneurial country in the world and the most innovative in the world. And it's baked into our ethos and our philosophy. In the past, 50 years or so, it's probably run amok a bit. But when you trace it back to the history, people move here to create a better life. And money, we both know is an important part of that pathway to freedom. And so I wanted to start this conversation going back to a guy that we've talked a little bit about, but just who I think is the father of personal finance, which is Ben Franklin and his work. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Ben Franklin and kind of his influence on you.
Yeah. So I don't know much about the history of Ben Franklin himself. I mean, I know a little bit. I've read about him in the past and I've read some of his stuff. But my understanding is he wasn't necessarily the best at personal finance. He had personal finance issues of his own, which is why he wrote about this stuff. And I think that's true even today. When you look at people who write about personal finance, I'm a good example. I started writing about personal finance because I sucked with money. And I think Ben Franklin was kind of along that lines too. He published the Poor Richard's Almanac, and it was filled with all sorts of maxims, not just about money, but about life in general. It was a way to help his contemporaries get better with money. And I think one interesting issue here is we have this idea that I know I used to hear it from my father, and I hear it all the time in the media that, oh, people who are older than us were better with managing their money. And it's just not true. People have struggled to manage their money in the United States since the country was founded. And it goes back even before that, obviously. But people have always struggled with personal finance. And so it's interesting to read Ben Franklin and see one of the founding fathers writing about these issues and trying to help people who were struggling back then, just like people struggle today.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting about Ben Franklin is he really is kind of at least the most visible, perhaps not the first, but certainly the earliest, most visible early retiree, because I think he left the printing business, I think at the age of 42, after, saving and investing his money, and then dedicated his life to the pursuit of, politics and his passion and travel. But he's one of those guys. Obviously, he's written quite a bit about frugality and saving money. But yeah, he was the first one that I know about to write about it and distribute that type of information to, I'd sort of say, everyday Americans. I mean, it has been from the beginning an immense amount of privilege to be able to have even a little extra money to be able to save. And that's the thing you naturally see, not only the number of personal finance books, but certainly the tone of them changing considerably through the 18 and then 1900s. As Americans started making more money and having a little bit more discretionary income, there started being more written about money. And so Ben Franklin was kind of an outlier, but from my standpoint, around kind of the 1850s, 1860s, there was more being written about kind of personal money management, but through the lens of managing a household, which I found really fascinating.
Right. Have you found Lydia Marie Childs yet? I can't remember the name of her book.
It sounds familiar.
She had a book, it's The Frugal Housewife, and it was published in 1832. And I remember writing about this early on at Get Rich Slowly when I was just starting it. And it's exactly what you might expect from a book written in 1832 about a frugal housewife. It's like, managing your domestic affairs, making sure you don't waste the flour once you've ground it, and how to stretch when you harvest the chicken or whatever, use every piece of it. And it's but that back then it was very practical, these personal finance books, and about subsistence a lot of times.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in most households, the finances were managed by, the wife or the female partner as a means of home economics. You're right. So making the most of the home and the money that's coming into the home. And then that trend, from, around that period, 1820s, 1830s, started blossoming around sort of, 1860 to 1880, where you start to see really the first kind of investing books coming out, where investing, even like now, it was for the select few, but there started to be more means by which you could actually grow your money. And I find that fascinating because there are a number of books from like the 1880s, 1890s that are reflections back on my 10 to 30 years in Wall Street. And, when you look at how Wall Street functioned in like the 1860s, 1870s, it was just a wild time that's actually not that different than today, where people wanted to get rich quick. They were taking way too much risk. But you do start to see a bit of the prudence narrative, which is fascinating because like 1870s, 1880s, you get this idea of, okay, save your pennies, invest your money, it's going to grow, and get rich slowly, I guess, is the best way to describe that. So even back then, this idea of financial independence, or, in that one book that we've talked about, Money and How to Make It, pecuniary independence. When that book's from what,
1872.
1872. Yeah, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So Ben Franklin's The Way to Wealth came out in 1758. That's when it was published. And it was kind of a collection of some of the stuff he'd written about Poor Richard's Almanac. And it's just kind of general financial advice. And that book that I mentioned earlier from Lydia Marie Childs, The Frugal Housewife, that's 1832. And then Walden, which is, you and I haven't talked about Walden yet, but I imagine it's a big influence for you. That's 1854. And Thoreau is writing about a personal economy in Walden. That had a profound impact on a lot of even modern financial writers. For example, Joe Dominguez, this is one of his primary influences when he wrote Your Money or Your Life. And then in 1864, we have 10 Acres Enough, which is about this guy moving from New York City. And I think he was working in finance and he wanted to go have 10 acres and raise fruits and berries and farm animals and support his family. And then in 1872, there's this book that you and I both found, Money and How to Make It. It's a crazy book. I don't know how much you've read through it, but a lot of it is about this agrarian stuff that we're talking about, like how to make money with geese, how to make money with wheat or whatever. But this is the first book where the phrase financial independence or the idea of financial independence is actually stated. And you're right. He calls it pecuniary independence. I just think it's fascinating. This concept has been around for so long. I was wondering, why is he calling it pecuniary independence? Why doesn't he call it financial independence? And so I did a deep dive into the word financial. And that word didn't come into existence until the late 1700s. And it didn't come into common use until the late 1800s. So 1872, you wouldn't have said financial blank. It was only like 10, 20 years later that you started saying financial whatever. So it was pecuniary independence because financial independence wouldn't have been the way they phrased it.
I also have a copy. My copy is not as nice as yours, the Money and How to Make It. But, as I read through that, you're right. Around the 1870s, 1880s, turn of the century, as you read these books and as you get into financial independence, what the title came out in 1907.
Oh, that's nice.
1907. So, but when you read it or you read Money and How to Make It, these books around that period, they're even more comprehensive and thorough, and I think better than the personal finance books of today. And I say that meaning once I read it, they're so comprehensive, they're so thought out. You would think they wouldn't have the mindset piece, but they do the mindset piece even better than we do today.
Some of these books, I mean, even though they're published in 1936 or 1946 or whenever they were published, they're more comprehensive and better for people wanting to pursue financial independence than some of the books that are published today, just because they are addressing the mindset piece. It's surprising how modern some of these older books are, and they are explicitly talking about financial independence.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the sort of core tenets of human nature. And one of the things that's interesting about financial independence since the beginning, since being written about in the 1870s, 80s, early 1900s, it's been positioned, as it should be, as being a different way to live.
Mm-hmm.
And you read in these old books where it's like everyone wants to get rich quick and everyone wants to, spend all their money and have all the toys. But if you live this other way, you can actually have more time and space and freedom and options in your life, which is somewhat of the paradox, live like no one else so you can have a life like no one else.
Yeah.
And I'm just, man, for as much as we've written and talked about this, I learn new things every old money book that I open up in terms of how to think about my life. And I think that people before the internet, before television, which is when most of these books were written, let's go back to Emerson, Thoreau's time, late 1800s, early 1900s, just having more time, A, you wouldn't live as long likely, and B, having more time to sit and think about life and the fact that it required, in some cases, less money to live. Houses were cheaper. You could have perhaps a higher quality of life with less money. There's some really deep thinking going on. And that's one of those double-edged swords of becoming FI, is that when you have a lot more time to think, yes, it can certainly make your life a lot richer, but it can also make your life more challenging in a sense. And I get that through reading the old books as well. You just realize how much time and how deep these thinkers thought and really how prolific they were. And I think they're more prolific than our writers today.
Well, and this brings up a question that I have, Grant. I'm going to ask you because maybe you have some thoughts on it. So when we look at the modern FIRE movement, the modern financial independence and early retirement, it's very recent focused, right? If you ask most people who are interested in this stuff to share a history of the financial independence movement, they're probably going to start with Joe Dominguez and Vicki Robin and Your Money or Your Life. They might have a different starting point. Most people wouldn't go much earlier than that. They might pick up on a couple of books that were published a little bit before, but some might start after that. But we don't seem to have a sense of history regarding these ideas. And I don't know why that is. I think it's generally an American problem with history itself, but I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that?
It's one of those weird things about human nature where there are very few original thoughts that happen. I mean, you go back and read the thinkers from 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and in some cases, you learn more from them than anything written today. We've been having the same problems. Humans crave the same things that we craved from the beginning. So, but what's interesting is that for some reason, information has to be reborn with every new generation.
It does.
And I don't quite know why. I'm sure there's something about translating human existence through a particular moment. And that's why I think what's fascinating about the FIRE movement is there's a number of forces for the first time in history that have collided to make this narrative more accessible to not only the narrative, but the actual path more accessible to a broader base of people. And I think the biggest thing is we're in like the fourth inning of the internet, where information spreads a lot faster. It's the technology, it's easier to make money in different ways.
And it's easier to connect with a community of like-minded people. So this book, Money and How to Make It, published in 1872, cost $20 at the time. So that's a chunk of change for back then.
Yeah.
And if you were fortunate to pick up a copy of that and to learn about pecuniary independence, you're probably the only one in your village or your neighborhood or your county that has a copy of that. Maybe there are a few other people scattered throughout the country that have it. But how do you connect with those people? How do you find those like-minded folks? And now with the internet, it's easy, man.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because it's like there's frugality out of necessity, and then there's frugality for life optimization's sake. And so I think historically most people have had to be frugal because they simply couldn't make more money or didn't have the opportunities. But now we've gotten into a time where all of these different tactics that have been used through history you can learn about them quickly and put them into your tool chest. Yeah. And so that's one of the things in writing Financial Freedom, looking back on my own journey, I didn't realize until I'd gone through it, how many small decisions that I decided to make that ended up compounding into me reaching financial independence. And so the frugality, I learned from my father. The how to make money, I learned from, the Tim Ferriss and, the internet economy. And the mindset piece I learned from, philosophy books, and the personal finance piece, I learned from, Vicki Robin and you and others. So I was naturally pulling from those pieces, but through history, you wouldn't have necessarily had that opportunity or access to that information. You're absolutely right. And it is so accessible now, and people are able to live lives that others could have never imagined even 50 years ago.
I mean, I feel fortunate to have what I have. I think about privilege a lot, and there's absolutely an element of privilege involved in this, no question.
Going back to your question about why don't people talk about what was written about personal finance before Your Money or Your Life or Vicki Robin, is that you have to look at, there are key moments where a message breaks through. And that was clearly one of those books that, Vicki being on Oprah, both of them being so brilliant around taking this idea of how many years of your life will you have to spend to buy this particular
the
thing.
life energy stuff.
Yeah. I mean, packaged the right way at the right time with the right message.
Is it Thoreau? Let me see. I've got a quote here from Thoreau. The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. So right there, you've got Joe Dominguez is just taking that, and he and Vicki are like blowing it up and expanding on it to come up with this whole concept of life energy. And
and that's the idea of things being reborn in every generation. Because I think we as Americans, we're all standing on the shoulders of others. And that's the cool thing about personal finance that I don't hear talked about at all, but I'm happy to talk about it now, is that anyone writing about personal finance or optimizing their life in this way, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And just like Joe Dominguez and Vicky with Thoreau, you with Vicky, me with you and Vicky. And so that's one of the things where it's like, there's not a single idea that I came up with probably in financial freedom, not a single one. What I did was, through my own experience, took others' ideas and lived my life, and then had a clearer picture and used it in my own life. So what makes it unique is that I lived it and I was able to make it happen and translate it in my own life. But I didn't come up with any of those tactics. I just put them together in a way to live my life.
And that's exactly what I always say. I always say that my ideas are not original to me. All I'm doing is synthesizing this information and repackaging it and trying to process it through my own experience. I think I have one idea that I consider unique to myself or from my own brain, and that's the wealth snowball idea.
Yeah. You want to explain that? Explain it to the audience.
The wealth snowball is essentially Mr. Money Mustache's shockingly simple math of early retirement. It's just the concept. So you've got Dave Ramsey's debt snowball, right? Mm-hmm. Or his version of the debt snowball. The debt snowball idea actually goes back further. And the debt snowball is you're applying a certain amount to your debts, and you keep applying that amount even as your monthly payments are reduced. You don't reduce how much you're actually spending or putting towards debt. And that makes it so that you're paying off the debt quicker and quicker and quicker. So the wealth snowball is basically the same idea. Is once you get the debt paid off, you don't stop this financial contribution you're making toward yourself each month. Now you start using that to invest, and you're creating a wealth snowball through compounding and appreciation.
Now we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Qapital, a banking app that helps you create and automate successful money habits. Designed in collaboration with Professor Dan Ariely, the world's leading behavioral economist, Qapital can help you reach your financial goals with smarter checking, savings, and investing tools. With over 70,000 five-star ratings in the App Store and on Google Play, over 2 million users, and over $1 billion saved, Qapital is worth checking out if you want to take your money to the next level. I've used it and find it intuitive and a no-brainer if you want to maximize the amount of money you're saving automatically and easily. To sign up, go to millennialmoney.com/capital. That's QAPITAL, or go to qapital.com or download straight from the App Store or Google Play. And don't forget to use the code GRANT to get $25 towards your first savings goal. So we've talked about the 1700s and late 1700s with Ben Franklin. We've talked about the early 1800s with frugality and managing the house and the economies of the house. We've talked about the late 1800s with the rise of pecuniary independence and starting to invest and starting to optimize your life. As we move into the 1900s, one of the things you see starting in the 1920s are just an immense number of books that start getting written about investing and economics. Benjamin Graham and Dodd and security analysis and the intelligent investor really takes over personal finance. By the 1950s,
oh yeah, then the investing books are everywhere.
It just takes off. But what I want to do is I want to fast forward through the 50s, 60s, 70s to kind of the late 80s, early 90s, which I would call kind of let's call it like the fourth generation of personal finance in the United States, where you start seeing the Susie Ormans of the world, Dave Ramsey's and the Robert Kiyosaki's and the Tony Robbins starting to write about money. The 90s, do you remember that period? Were you exposed? I mean, I was a little kid. Were you exposed to that at all?
During the 1990s, that's when I was deep in debt and I was accumulating consumer debt. So I was reading money books, but I was looking for silver bullets. I was looking for magic bullets. So I was reading books like Nothing Down. I forget the author, the guy who wrote Nothing Down. I was like looking for ways you could get rich quickly. And it wasn't until 2003, 2004, when somebody gave me a copy of Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover. And then another friend gave me a copy of Your Money or Your Life. I read those books. And then I started going to the public library and borrowing more personal finance books, including some of those books from the 90s. That's when I started being aware of personal finance and seeing the theme. That's where I came up with the concept of get rich slowly. I'm like, oh, the recurring theme in all these books is there's no reliable way to get rich quickly, but there is a reliable way to get rich slowly. And so that's where my journey began, I guess, is from reading the books that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, what's interesting is that during that period, it's sort of, obviously the credit card being released in the 50s and
Yeah.
more access to credit and debt. There has been, it seems to be a correlation between the amount of personal finance writers and information and the amount of debt that Americans are in.
This is a good point. This brings up an interesting subject. So one of the best books that I have read about personal finance in a long time, I love this book. It's not for everyone, but it's called Financing the American Dream by Lendl Calder. And it's a cultural history of consumer credit. And I think it started as a doctoral thesis. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was his doctoral thesis. But this book is insanely researched with so many interesting footnotes. You and I are talking about all these books we've been buying. Well, some of my buying spree is spurred by the footnotes in this book, because he's writing about the history of credit in the United States and how we've been using credit since day one. It's just credit evolves over time. And he talks about what he calls the myth of lost economic virtue. He went into this, writing this book or doing his doctoral thesis with this belief that many of us have, that previous generations were better at managing money and they didn't take on debt or they didn't use credit. And his point is, well, actually turns out, yes, they did. It's changed over time how we use the credit. So it's interesting to see the books that you and I are talking about in the 90s. Well, let's use Dave Ramsey as an example. I mean, Dave Ramsey comes on and he's totally anti-debt, which is great. I'm with him. Let's be anti-debt. But it's not a new phenomenon that people use debt to fund their lifestyles. And what Calder in Financing the American Dream comes to the conclusion. I mean, he started out with this assumption that it's a recent phenomenon, but from the 1920s on, basically. His conclusion is that, credit is actually a way for people who don't have a high income to elevate their lifestyle in the present. I don't want to use mortgaging your future as the metaphor here, because that's a negative spin on it. But without credit, people would have to wait 15, 20 years to own a home, right? You wouldn't be able to save enough to have a house until 15 or 20 years later. But with credit, you can do it. Same with buying a car. And so it's just interesting to read this. There are some good uses for credit.
Yeah, absolutely. When used responsibly. And it seemed like it was used much more responsibly when it first started debuting during that generation. So like late 1800s, early 1900s into 1920, you see kind of the growth and the proliferation of the personal savings account. And you start to see these banks coming out where people can, deposit money and grow their money or take out loans. But it was very personal. It was very relational based. So you knew your banker. It was a relationship.
Exactly.
There was trust.
Or you're going down to the local, I guess grocery stores are a 20th century invention, but you're going down to the local store or market to get your food or your feed for your livestock.
Yeah.
And on credit, but you have a relationship with the owner of that store.
Yeah. And now, fast forward through into the 90s and the 2000s, when the responsible use of credit ballooned into an irresponsible sort of, I'd say, greed-fueled use of credit. Hence, it's actually made this narrative and personal finance information even more important. But you do see a lot of the books in the 90s to kind of early 2000s, mid 2000s are really focused on this idea of getting out of debt, or let's say retiring. I call them my parents' personal finance books, retiring in 35, 45 plus years by saving 5 to 10% of your income. And I still think most of America, when they think about money, even the personal finance curriculums that I've seen that are taught in schools, have that type of 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, retire at 65.
Money mindset. But what's crazy is that, you've got the Ben Franklins in the 1700s retiring at 42. And obviously you've had people, Joe Dominguez, there are others who've written about that, but it's still now really for the first time in history with the FIRE movement, because I think of these confluence of forces. I think there was a study, it was something, one of the big banks did it. I'm sure you've seen it. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And it was something like 41% of Americans surveyed had heard of the FIRE movement.
Oh, really? I didn't realize it was that big. Wow.
Yeah, it was substantial. Wow. And so, or knew what it was, or had heard it mentioned. So I really think it's the first time in history where it's reached enough critical mass. And now I feel like it's just fractured into an infinite number of ways to live, which is so fascinating to see as more content creators were creating content. But, I'd love for you to share, since you were creating, content kind of in the 2000s and have been writing about this now for quite a while. What have you seen changed over that period?
That's an interesting question. So there is definitely an evolution, an ongoing progression of what topics are covered. And as we have this ongoing conversation, certain principles, they get distilled out of the conversation. And so they become very clear that, oh, this is an important principle. So an example of the way the conversation changes is when I started writing back in 2006, I was writing about general personal finance, but a lot of it was about frugality. And then soon after that, we had the downturn or the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And then frugality was a hot topic. There was no question. Over the last decade, though, as the economy came roaring back, all of a sudden financial independence and early retirement are the big topics because people are in good financial spots. We have a very healthy, very robust economy, and people are experiencing all these gains in the stock market. And all of a sudden, there are more people who can retire early. So it's interesting to see how that has shifted. As far as the ideas that get distilled out of this, for me, one of the biggest things I've come to realize, I wrote an article early on at Get Rich Slowly when I started it back in 2006. I wrote about the fundamental law of personal finance. And that is your wealth is what you earn minus what you spend. I mean, this is very basic. And I wrote just a short article. I called this the fundamental law of personal finance. And then I just forgot about it. What I've come to realize over the past 15 years or almost 15 years is that really is all a person needs to know. That is the engine, the gap between your earning and your spending. Fundamentally, this is the one core principle that drives everything. And the greater the gap between your earning and your spending, the quicker you can pursue your financial goals and your other goals. And sometimes you don't want that gap to be so wide. Maybe you want it to be very close because you want to experience more in the present. It's when you widen that gap, you're paying off your debt or you're funding your future. If you feel restricted because you're saving too much, your saving rate is too high, well, you can close that gap and you can enjoy more of today. So for me, the one principle that I've been most impressed with over the past 15 years is this idea, the gap between earning and spending, the fundamental law, as I call it.
Yeah, the simplicity of it's so beautiful.
And people they want it to be more complicated than that. But it's not. That is all it is. It's so crazy.
So when you look out at the personal finance world now, you do a little bit of content curation, you read blogs, there's some great content that's being created out there now. Do you remain hopeful about personal finance content?
Oh, yeah.
What are you excited about? What do you see kind of happening moving forward here?
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is as the FIRE movement matures, that's the word I want to use, is there's a lot more thought being put into it. I think that people need to start with purpose and meaning. That is the place you start. And from there, you construct your life, your financial life, and the rest of your life around your purpose and meaning. And I think as the FIRE movement becomes more mature, other people are beginning to realize the importance of this. It's helping them define how they're going to construct their lives, what they're going to do with their job, what they're going to spend. And I like to see that. More and more people are focusing on the psychological side or the emotional side of saving and investing and figuring out what they want out of life. And I like to see that.
I think there's been a shift, and you've been a huge part of that. And Vicky, it's just more people are thinking about what's the purpose of this money. It's not about having everything in the world.
And it goes just beyond a personal purpose. I think you've got to start with a personal purpose, but I think a lot of people, especially younger people, really want to make a positive change. And Vicky Robin, when she was involved with Your Money or Your Life, which she still is, her whole purpose is to try to change the world. She doesn't want to help people get rich. She wants to help the world become a better place. And there are a lot of people who want to help make the world a better place. I do too. And I think that the financial independence movement, I think people in it are beginning to realize that, when I become financially independent, I'm going to need to have some sort of greater purpose. Retiring early or becoming financially independent allows people to do things like focus on the world at large. When you've got your own house in order, it's so much easier and more effective to focus on the world at large.
Man, we've covered so much ground from the 1700s.
It makes me wonder, it makes me wonder where we'll go in the future, man. What in 100 years, what are people, they're going to be sitting around recording holograms talking about, I found this old book by Grant Sabatier and here's one by J.D. Roth and look at their ideas.
I don't know, man. That's for another conversation. But I think there's going to be an increasing amount of uncertainty in the future vis-a-vis politics and the climate and the economy. And I think it's going to be, next 100 years are going to be really challenging. But I go back and double down on the fact that money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love. There are tools
Absolutely.
and resources and information and blueprints, and people are living lives and creating things in so many different ways. It goes back to that idea we started with, which is choose your own path, choose to live your life differently than others, and you will truly find your way.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been so great having you on,
absolutely,
and chatting and I was really looking forward to diving into these ideas and these books, and we'll revisit it in the near future. Maybe we'll pick like a 20-year period and do a deep dive into history, because this isn't being talked about. And it's an exciting area for me because I, like you, as I get older, I realize how much truth there is in what's already been created. And often the path forward is hidden somewhere in the path that we've already traveled. So,
I love that. That's great.
All right. Thanks for coming on, man. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Grant.